Welcome to episode 137. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Today's episode is an Ask Me Anything featuring questions submitted by members of the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group on Facebook. We're doing a new AMA episode every few months, so if you want to join the conversation and be able to contribute your questions, be sure to head over and join the group. There are lots of great people and conversations over there, and we would love to have you. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
All right, so let's dig right into the questions. The first one's from Tamara. She says, my nephew is autistic and has sensitivities that are sometimes much more prevalent depending on his mood. My sister decided to modify his birthday party and took him to each attendee's house to visit one-on-one. Do you have any other ideas about how to accommodate these kinds of sensitivities? So first of all, let me just say, I love this accommodation. A child who has trouble regulating their emotions, especially when they are excited about a birthday celebration, can easily feel overwhelmed by the number of people and the environment at a typical child's birthday party. Visiting friends in a smaller setting allows them the opportunity to celebrate in a way that is less stimulating and stressful. I think social situations, parties, holidays, all of these can be really difficult to accommodate because there are so many norms and expectations surrounding these types of events. Hosting a child's birthday party based on their preferences makes a ton of sense, but there are other types of celebrations that might be more difficult. I know of one person who has a lot of social anxiety and doesn't want their parents to host a graduation party for them. But there's just a lot of social pressure to have this type of event and for a teen to just tough it out. The holiday season is another stressful time for families. I think the bottom line in any of these situations is to carefully weigh out the expectations versus what's manageable for the neurodivergent people in your life. It might require setting some boundaries with people or getting creative with some accommodations. Remember that just because something is a quote-unquote tradition doesn't mean that it can't be changed. And you can always make your own traditions too. Dawn wrote and just asked for suggestions about strategies and tools to deal with interoception. So interoception is our eighth sense, beyond the usual five, which include visual, olfactory, gustatory, auditory, and tactile. We also have our vestibular sense, which is how we sense our body moving in space, and our proprioceptive sense, which helps us know where our body is in relation to other objects in our environment and how we interact with them. Interoception is all about how our brain interprets the signals sent through our body internally. So, for example, whether we're feeling hungry or thirsty or maybe hot or cold. One of the other factors that's greatly impacted by our interoceptive sense is our ability to identify and regulate our emotions. Our brains get a lot of information about how we are feeling emotionally based on the signals that we receive from our bodies. And if we have a hypo or hypersensitivity to interoceptive signals, or a mix of both, depending on the situation, it can influence how we interpret that situation. One of the first steps that we can use to build a sense of interoception is to use observable traits to help make inferences about what's happening. So, for example, we could make an observation and say, I notice that your face is kind of red and it looks like your forehead is sweaty. Do you notice that? I wonder if your body is getting overheated. Even if a child doesn't feel the hotness in their body, they can learn to react to those other observable traits by taking off a sweatshirt or something along those lines. When we are talking more about emotions, it can be helpful to focus on the thinking that's occurring. Build an awareness of what they're thinking in a moment. I found that drawing little stick figures with a cartoon thought bubble can be a good tool to help this become more tangible. Then we can work to find an emotion word that might describe those thoughts. These sensory processing differences in neurodivergent people will require accommodations over the years. And one of the best things we can do is help them recognize and understand the differences so they can communicate their needs with others. Whether it's a doctor who needs to understand that they feel pain differently than others, or a request for an accommodation to use the restroom without permission in school, being able to advocate for themselves is a huge factor to help with this. Jen wants to know about 504 accommodations and developing neurodivergent affirming IEP goals. Because every child is so different, it's really hard to come up with specific accommodations or goals based only on a diagnosis. So what I think will be most useful for the purpose of this conversation will be to talk about the process of developing accommodations and goals. When I try to do this, I try to consider 3 different aspects as a framework as I develop these goals with families and teachers. So the first idea is to make sure that you're involving the child in the process, no matter how young. They will learn to self-advocate and trust themselves when they see their feedback and insights about their own needs are being taken into account. The second piece is to consider the whole child. Move beyond just looking at academics and include a child's strengths, their affective needs, and their cognitive ability as you create the plan. And finally, I think this gets overlooked, but I just think it's important to be really creative in this process. Just because a certain accommodation hasn't been offered before doesn't mean that it can't be offered now. Just because a particular goal hasn't been implemented into the school's IEPs in the past doesn't mean that it can't be this time. Some teachers and administrators are more flexible than others, but I think when parents and students and teachers come together to brainstorm ideas that will work, we can be really successful with finding ways to meet their needs. In my book, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom, I actually talk about the 5 different ways we can accommodate students. So if you're trying to brainstorm and you're looking for ideas, you might check it out. There's even a downloadable printout called an Accommodations Needs Screener that can be useful when we're trying to brainstorm the various types of accommodations a student might need. These are the 5 areas of accommodations that we can consider when we're trying to figure out how to support kids. So there are behavioral accommodations, where we work with students to find ways to help them self-regulate their emotions. There are environmental accommodations, which look at ways to alter the learning environment to make it more accessible for neurodivergent kids. Instructional accommodations ask the teacher to find ways to shift how they are presenting the material or how the student is completing the practice work. Evaluative accommodations adjust how we assess what a student has learned, and organizational accommodations can help a student with executive functioning types of skills. Looking at each of these 5 areas and identifying how a student's needs might be met in each area can give some direction to this process. Amy writes, as a parent of a rising high schooler with an IEP, I would love to have Emily reflect on ways to make IEP meetings less stressful for parents. I've been in tons of them and still feel so much dread before each one. Oh, Amy, how I wish this were an easy fix. I can understand how parents feel totally overwhelmed as they go into this meeting. There's often a team of people there, which can feel less like a team and more like an army. Of course, in no way is this meeting intended to be adversarial, but it can be scary when you're a parent sitting there with all of these experts around the table. I think a lot of the pressure to make this seem less intimidating really falls on the school. One of the major things that the staff of a school can do to help parents is offer one person who acts as a liaison to the parent. Maybe this is the school counselor or someone who's been helping the family through the initial steps of the process. Interpreting any type of jargon into language the parents can understand, and making sure that the conversation doesn't end up being just a conversation among the educators with the parents on the sidelines is really important. Also, clear expectations of what options or services are available and which aren't available is necessary to provide that sense of informed consent. Giving lots of time for parents to ask clarifying questions and also inviting those questions can help parents feel like they are part of the process. For parents, in preparation of the IEP meeting, first, understand that educators want to do what is best for your child. They may be bound by regulations or protocols specific to federal law or district policy, but they are in this industry because they believe they can help kids. Their goal isn't to gatekeep services, even though I know it can sometimes feel that way when you know your kid needs help and they can't or won't find a way to work with them. The next parts of it depend on how you experience your anxiety about the situation. What are the questions or the fears that are causing you to feel stressed? Are you uncomfortable about hearing the things that your child is struggling with at school? Are you worried that the school won't listen to you? Maybe you're stressed about the amount of information that will be shared and whether or not you'll be able to make heads or tails of it. Maybe you're anxious about being in an unfamiliar social environment where you'll be asked to advocate and speak up for your child. All of these feelings are totally normal, but when you can narrow down the source of your stress, you might be able to find solutions to minimize it. Maybe feeling prepared with a list of questions can help, or asking for an agenda of the meeting in advance to help you prepare could get rid of some of that stress. If you want to bring an advocate, do so. If you can't afford or find an advocate, bring a friend who can take notes so you don't have to try to regulate your emotions, advocate for your child, and remember everything that is said all by yourself. I know that IEPs and 504 meetings are difficult, but I hope that by the end of the meeting, you feel heard and your child feels supported. Daisy wants to know about attachment problems specifically related to being gifted. She asks, how can I cope with the challenges? Does it matter whether behavior can be explained by attachment problems, early childhood trauma, or being gifted? I know I'm not the only adoptive mom who tries to cope with this combination. So, the basics of attachment theory are based on the fact that having a secure attachment style is important as we grow because it influences our ability to have healthy relationships throughout our lives. Being able to feel safe with our caregivers as an infant and a young child establishes the ability to trust relationships and feel secure, to take risks and manage anxiety. Many adoptive parents have children who struggle with developing healthy attachment, depending on the type of environment that was present in the child's early months. In general, I would say that being cognitively gifted is unrelated to the concerns about the attachment challenges. As a matter of fact, most research about giftedness that doesn't have sampling bias errors shows that being intelligent improves overall life outcomes, including satisfaction in relationships. That being said, it's definitely possible that a kiddo who's dealing with attachment difficulties and trauma is influenced by their cognitive abilities. I often like to say that we have to look at any concern that a gifted child is having through that lens of giftedness. For example, a gifted kid with a history of trauma might utilize their advanced verbal comprehension and logic skills to justify their emotions and actions. They can talk around us at about 1,000,000 miles a minute, and it can be hard to get through to them. The flip side of this is that we can utilize this for some strengths-based supports. How can we leverage their verbal ability or logical reasoning skills to help them see these situations in different ways? A lot of times, bright kids can learn and utilize different types of coping skills at a younger age than their peers, which can work to their advantage. Attachment issues are difficult to get through, and Daisy, you're right. You aren't the only adoptive parent trying to deal with this unique combination of neurodivergence. Keep at it and know that you aren't alone. Omema asks about testing and assessments for twice exceptionality, but I do think that this answer can apply to any type of assessment we're doing with neurodivergent kids or adults. So part of the testing procedures include a list of protocols, and examiners have to use those consistently to make sure that the scores are comparable among groups. So what that means for accommodations, though, is that we have to be really careful about how we utilize them in that testing situation. Now, I could argue either side of the argument about whether or not we should be more accommodating during assessments for neurodivergent people, but we do have to follow those protocols. So what's really even realistic when we're trying to work with a child for assessment? I think the first thing that we can do takes place outside of the testing environment while we're still at home. How do we prep the kids prior to them going into this testing experience? So when I'm talking about testing preparation, I'm not talking about studying or preparing in order to increase a kid's scores. These tests are meant to be novel experiences for a child, and going into an evaluation where we aren't going to get an accurate estimate of what they can do doesn't do any favors. So what I'm really talking about is how we talk to our kids about the upcoming evaluation. I usually encourage parents to kind of try to strike a balance between wanting the child to do their best work, but also not causing too much stress or making it seem like the stakes are extremely high. So something like, we're going to go and do some work with someone so we can learn more about how your brain works, so your teachers can teach you better and I can be a better parent for you. That's just one example of how we can talk to our kids about this process. So if you have a child who's a perfectionist, or if they have a lot of anxiety, it's also really important to normalize the fact that they will not know all of the answers, and they aren't supposed to know all of the answers. The way most of these tests work is that they start with easier items and they get progressively more difficult, because what they're doing is they're looking for the ceiling of a child's ability. So in order to measure this, they have to push the child to go just beyond what their ability is. So we can encourage kids to know that they can just make their best guess, and when it's an open-ended question, to just give as much information as they can, because there's no penalty for having the wrong answer, so they might as well guess. Also, we want to make sure that they're prepared to take their time. When there's a multiple choice question, they really need to look at all of their options before saying what their choice is. So one last word about prep before the assessment. We have to be careful about searching for study guides or tools online to prepare your child for an assessment. Some online sources claim to provide information to prepare your child for an assessment. However, some of these items are so close to the actual test items that it will invalidate the test scores if the psychometrist can tell if a child has been prepped. And trust me, kids are terrible at masking this. There is no harder conversation to have with a parent than one where you have to tell them that the test can't be completed or scored because their kiddo has been prepared too much. Parents don't know this, and of course are just trying to give their kids as many opportunities as possible. But in this situation, we want to let kids show what they can do on their own. So back to the idea about accommodations during the test, especially with anxiety. If you are doing testing in a private setting outside of the schools, you can ask the examiner if it's okay to have a short rapport building meeting with the kiddo prior to the assessment to help overcome some social anxiety. You can ask about the process for breaks or snacks and drinks during the assessment. These little things seem pretty minor, but they can make a big difference in a child's comfort level as they go through the assessment. And a skilled examiner will encourage children to ask questions if they don't understand instructions, and they will allow a child to move around or stim or fidget as needed. If your child's being assessed in the school, you can request to be notified the day before the assessment to give your child a heads up about the upcoming evaluation, and that can be a big help for a lot of kids who get kind of nervous about it. But I do know that there are a lot of schools that don't schedule in this way. The last thing that I would suggest along these lines is just to talk to the examiner in depth about your child prior to the assessment. Ultimately, you are the person who knows your child best, and helping the examiner have an understanding of your observations can help them make sure that they are meeting their needs and that they're getting the most accurate information possible. Okay, so the next question is from Rhonda, and she writes this. I'd like some help on how to speak to my family about why my little girl is her type of normal, having neurodiversity. They think she has an attitude for speaking her beautiful mind. It is causing friction. So family members often think that they know what is best, and too often offer their unsolicited opinions and advice. So depending on the relationship that you have with them, you may need to find ways to set some healthy boundaries. For example, you could request that they don't share their opinion with your daughter or try to discipline her based on their expectations. And if they have concerns, you can let them know that they're welcome to talk to you about them in private, but not in front of your daughter. Maybe there's a book or a resource that you found useful. Maybe there are some episodes of this podcast, and they might be open to exploring and learning more about your daughter and how to understand her. Offering them suggestions on communicating with her. So, for example, if you use declarative language and have found that really useful when you're talking with your daughter, maybe you can explain to them those communication techniques, and maybe they can try to attempt to use those too. As we all know, the world still has a long way to go to understand neurodivergent people. The fact that you understand your daughter and find joy in what others consider attitude is going to have a huge impact on how she sees and accepts herself as she gets older. So kudos on that. So that's about all the time we have for today. There were some questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, but we will move those forward to our list for our next AMA, which will take place here in a few months. Don't forget, if you want to be included and be able to submit your questions, go to our Facebook page and join the group, the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group on Facebook. I would love to see you there, and thanks for listening. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
This is a production of the Neurodiversity Alliance.